Welcome to the Story Fulfilled podcast, where we deep dive into how each character and story in the Bible come together to fulfill the story of God.
I'm Fletcher.
And I'm Jay.
And today's story is about Samuel.
Not to be confused with Samwise.
Samwise Gamgee. Samuel de Champlain.
No, not to be confused with that one either.
When was Samuel de Champlain? 2,400 years
After
this story. So he was the original, not Samuel de Champlain.
That's right.
If you're not Canadian and you don't know who Samuel de Champlain is, it's like the Canadian version of Columbus. Or the Quebec version of Columbus.
Yeah.
Not like Jacques Cartier is the Canadian version. Right. Anyway, doesn't really matter. None of this matters. We're talking about a different Samuel today.
That's right. Samuel, who we read about in the book of 1 Samuel. So
yeah, and he's dead by 2 Samuel, ironically.
Yeah, but he still gets a whole book.
He still gets a whole book. He's not even in it. Oh well.
So as always, we do encourage you to read for yourself to kind of just get an idea of what is going on. And as I said, today's story takes place in 1 Samuel. Mm-hmm. So last week we talked about Manoah and his wife, and they received a message from God that they would have a son. And like we talked about, they did have the son, and they named him Samson. And dude was messed up. He had a whole slew of issues.
We didn't tell the story.
Yeah. But he didn't really listen to anyone. He lived.
If you remember the vow that he was supposed to take from birth, it was be pure, abstain from alcohol, don't cut your hair, don't touch unclean things.
Yeah.
I think he broke all of those.
He broke all of them.
He did.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Despite that, and that's the really cool thing is that God used him. He was a judge over Israel. He helped free Israel from the Philistines. So I'm not going to tell you to go and live like he did, because God will use you anyway. But don't ever feel that you're so far that God can't use you. When we look back at the story, we say, well, maybe he could have been more successful in what he had done. Maybe he wouldn't have died doing it, because in the end of Samson's story, he ends up dying to fight the Philistines. And it's like, well, maybe that could have gone a little smoother. Maybe you weren't blind with your eyes plucked out, chained to a wall, if you had done the right thing in the first place. That's right.
We're just commenting on the story at this point. That's not necessarily true. We don't know what would have happened.
Not an unhelpful commentary though. But of course, as they have been doing throughout the book, Israel once again does evil in the sight of the Lord, and again we see that they're handed over to their enemies. And so, if you read through the book of Judges, you just see that cycle happening over and over and over again. Long story short, place was a mess. Everyone did what was right in the sight of their own eyes, and as we've discussed, that never, ever goes well. But toward the end of the period of the Judges, there's a man called Eli, and he was a priest and a judge over Israel, and he lived in Shiloh, and that's where the tabernacle was resting during that period.
And Eli, he wasn't bad.
No.
He was a priest, he did his job, he was a judge. He wasn't too bad.
Yeah.
So in comparison to all the other stories, if you read the last chapters of Judges, you're like, wow, Israel's a mess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Eli's doing some things right. He's a priest. He does his job.
He's
okay.
Mostly good.
Yeah, for the most part.
Yeah. And at the same time, there's a man. His name is Elkanah, and he has two wives, Hannah and Peninnah,
something like that.
Peninnah.
Panini. I'm hungry though, so that's probably influencing
Panera.
Oh, there you go, Panera.
Peninnah had children, and Hannah did not. And we've read this story a few times throughout the text, right? There's a man has more than one wife, and one has children, the other doesn't. She feels inferior and unloved and uncared for by God. A whole slew of
It's crazy how
emotions.
It's the exact same story as
Yeah.
Jacob and Leah and Rachel.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
that's very cool.
And so they lived at a place called Ramathaim.
Yeah, sure.
I'm having a hard time today with
These Hebrew names.
Yeah, that's
Who
right.
knows?
But they traveled to Shiloh each year to make sacrifices to God. And so one time when they traveled to Shiloh, Panera was mocking Hannah for not having kids.
Oh.
Like rubbing salt in the wounds and just kind of making things worse. And so Hannah goes to the temple to pray to God and ask him to give her a child. And she promises God that if she has a son, she would dedicate him to God and that she would not cut his hair. And if you remember last week, we talked about the Nazirite vow, makes the same vows that she would give her child to God in his service. And Eli the priest is there, and he notices Hannah praying, and he's like, "Hey, lady, put the booze away and go home. You're drunk," right? Like just the way that she's praying, she's so fervently praying. He's like, "There's something wrong here. You're in public here.
Yeah.
You're at the temple."
I think it's like she's crying, her mouth's moving, but nothing's coming out.
Yeah.
It's she's really into it.
Really into it. And Hannah's like, no, I'm not drinking. I'm actually pouring my heart out to God. I'm not drunk. And I think like Eli's funny because like you said, he's mostly good, but there's some things that are off about him, and we'll get to those things. And I think there's something interesting here about not recognizing when somebody is engaged in godly activities. That maybe we're seeing in Eli.
Yeah, why is he assuming that she's drunk? Maybe he's used to seeing a lot of drunk people around, and he's surrounded by that. Maybe,
Yeah,
but
or he's not used to seeing people praying,
praying.
and praying this emotionally and being this invested in prayer. But he does the priestly thing. He blesses her, and he sends her on her way, and says to her, "May the Lord grant your request."
And so the story that we're going to tell today, it takes place, like Jay said, in a place called Shiloh. And so Shiloh is this town. It's where the tabernacle was located for most of the time of the judges. So everybody was going there to sacrifice to God. Ramathaim, however we pronounced it, where the family lived is in the hill country of Ephraim, and it's roughly 30 kilometers west of Shiloh. And they're both in kind of the land of Ephraim. We talked about that last week, where all the 12 tribes are kind of separated. And Shiloh is about 30 kilometers north of Jerusalem, so that can kind of situate you on the map. As for timeline-wise, this is taking place 1100 to 1000 BC, the early Iron Age, late Bronze Age. Things are changing in the area, right? They've just recently conquered the land. They've lived there, but the enemies are still surrounding them, right? There's the Moabites, there's the Ammonites, the Amalekites, the Philistines. They're constantly fighting. They're capturing Israel. Israel's breaking free.
Right.
As for major players like around the world, there's Egypt, there's Assyria, there's the Hittites in the north. So they're surrounded by all sorts of people, and Israel is struggling to survive it by itself, let alone from the influence of other nations.
Yeah.
And so we get into this story. Hannah goes away from the tabernacle. She's less sad. It says her face was lifted. She's like, "Oh, the priest blessed me. Maybe this will happen." And she goes home, and she ends up sleeping with her husband, as you do. And it says, "The Lord remembered Hannah, and she conceived and gave birth to a son."
Nice.
And so if you remember a few seconds ago, we just said Hannah had promised to dedicate the boy to God. And so she keeps this promise and dedicates the boy as a Nazirite to God. And I almost slipped and said his name, but his name was Samuel. That's what she named him. And Samuel, the translation means I asked God for him, and he gave him to me. So she names him Samuel, and she says to her husband, "Listen, I'm going to wean the boy, and then I'm going to give him to God." And Elkanah, the dad's like, "Okay, you do what you need to do."
Right.
and so she raises him, weans him, and then basically goes to the tabernacle with an animal and a grain offering and says, here's my son. He gives him to Eli and says he's to be in God's service for his life. And so she offers a sacrifice and prays this prayer over Samuel. You can go read it, actually. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 2, and you see Hannah's prayer to God, and it's this cool prayer of faithfulness of who God is, and Hannah really felt that as she had a son and was blessed by God.
Yeah. And
so while this is happening, right, Samuel's been dedicated to God, and he's now staying and living at the tabernacle as a helper, as a minister, as whatever they needed him to be. And Eli is still the priest, and he actually has these two sons, and they're named Hophni and Phinehas, and they're priests under their father, but they're not the good kind.
No.
So Hophni and Phinehas are basically a mess, and they're despicable in the eyes of God, and they really don't do their jobs properly, and they don't fear God.
Yeah, and they even bring a bad name on his house and on God, really.
If you remember, on God, absolutely. But if you remember, we just said Eli was really good. He wasn't great at keeping his sons in check, and so they were running around. They were like sticking their fork in the pot to steal extra meat for themselves for the sacrifice. They'd flirt and sleep with the women who came to the tabernacle.
Yep.
They disrespected the sacrifice. They disrespected God. They disrespected the whole institution that they were supposed to be leading and working in.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the same passage, it's saying how terrible these two guys are. And then in the next line, it says, "But Samuel." He says he ministered to God in the tabernacle, and he grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men.
Interesting phrase.
We might talk about that a little later. I'm sure we will.
Yeah.
Because it says there's another passage in the Bible where
it says those words about someone else.
And so Samuel is growing up, and he's ministering to God in the temple. And that's where we find ourselves today. And so you can read along with us. It's in 1 Samuel. And Samuel is a little bit older, and he's sleeping in the tabernacle as he always does. He works there. And Eli is older, and he's blind. He's losing his eyesight, and he's doing something, but it's almost nighttime, and Samuel's gone to bed. And he's sleeping, and all of a sudden he hears a voice saying, "Samuel." And Samuel gets up, and he thinks it's Eli, so he runs over, and he says, "Oh, what is it? What do you need?" And Eli says, "Oh, I didn't call you."
Yeah.
He's like, "Okay, whatever." And so he goes back to bed. He hears again, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel's like, "Okay, I got to go back to work, go see Eli." Eli's like, "I didn't call you." And this happens a few times. And eventually Eli catches on, and he goes, "Samuel, I think God's talking to you. So next time you hear this voice, just say, 'Yes, Lord, your servant is listening.'" And so Samuel goes back to bed, and once again he hears the voice, and it says, "Samuel, Samuel." And he responds, "Yes, Lord."
Yeah.
And so this is the message that Samuel actually gets from God while sleeping in the tabernacle, right? So it's in 1 Samuel chapter 3.
Yep. So we pick up in verse 11. It says, "Then the Lord said to Samuel, I am about to do a shocking thing in Israel. I am going to carry out all my threats against Eli and his family from beginning to end. I have warned him that judgment is coming upon his family forever because his sons are blaspheming God, and he hasn't disciplined them. So I have vowed that the sins of Eli and his sons will never be forgiven by sacrifices or offerings." Ouch.
Yeah. So that's a harsh message that Samuel, who's still relatively young and just learning all the duties of a priest, and then God comes and says, "Your boss, this guy you've worked with your whole life now, he's under judgment. My representative, he's under judgment, and bad things are coming because of what they've done."
Yeah. And let him know, would you?
Yeah, let him know. And so Eli has gotten this message a few times already, and he's kind of not done anything about it. And now Samuel's the one to deliver the message to his boss and his father figure at the time that God is about to judge you.
Fun times.
So it's quite the message that Samuel now has to deliver. And so we'll go into talking about that, and what the heck is about this message that he received, who's talking to him, that kind of question. So we're going to explore that a little bit further, but with our guests.
That's
so
right.
Don't go anywhere.
Stick around. Hey, thanks for listening. We love that you're on this journey through this podcast with us, and we'd love to hear from you. Questions that you have, or comments or observations, we'd love for you to just check in with us. So send us an email, story@bfmc.org, or connect with us on our Instagram @StoryFulfilledPodcast, and we'd love to hear from you.
I'm And we're back.
We are back indeed.
And we have a very, very special guest.
That's right. Oh, was that the first very, very?
I don't know. I don't keep track of them anymore.
I don't know.
Somebody's probably keeping track.
We were called out on calling people very special guests and very, very special guests. And
you're a very, very special guest, apparently. That's what we get.
Good. That's right.
Who do we have today, Jay?
We have Tricia De Boer with us. Tricia, who are you? Introduce yourself. What do you do?
Well, I'm Tricia. My name's Tricia, and I'm really excited to be here with you all. I am a missionary, and I'm serving in Uganda, Africa, with an incredible indigenous organization called I Live Again Uganda. And we work specifically with people that have survived war, providing trauma counseling, discipleship, resettlement, and community development. I have an amazing job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Tricia and I go way back.
I was going to say, how did we land?
Yeah.
A missionary in Uganda. That's cool.
We just put a Craigslist ad for Ugandan missionaries to come join the podcast. No, Tricia and I go way back. We uncovered in our pre-recording conversation that it was 20 years ago that we began working together at a ministry in Toronto called the Scott Mission, where we did after-school programs and camp ministry. And then Tricia and I actually did some community ministry during the summer in Scott Mission as well. And so, and then 10 years ago, I actually was privileged to go over and visit Tricia and the team in Uganda.
And we're waiting for the return.
Every time I see her, I'm reminded that I need to get back.
That's great.
So we're really excited to have Tricia here to be a part of.
Yes, thank you so much for coming on the show. And as usual, we always start with a fun question for our guests. And she's kind of heard it, but we didn't say it very loud. So it's their first time hearing it, of course.
That's right.
The question is, because we're talking about Samuel and he hears this voice and he's not sure who it is there any time where you have mistaken somebody for somebody else?
Yeah, like what's your best mistaken identity story?
Yeah, something funny.
Yeah.
Jay said he had a great story.
I didn't say it was great necessarily.
I think Jay might have to respond to this because I can't even think of anything, to be honest. Yeah. I think my eyesight is just maybe better than Jay's, and I was able to figure it out.
Well, this actually happened when I was like 6. We were at a flea market with my family, and I kind of got turned around, and I wasn't sure where I was and who I was looking for, and then I saw my dad walking away, and so I ran up to him and I grabbed a hold of his hand, and I was holding his hand, and then I looked up and that was not my dad.
No.
It was a man wearing the same jacket as my dad. And then I was frozen. I stopped, and then my dad was right like on the other aisle. That's funny. So it was fine. I was able to stay with my dad.
How old were you again?
Like 6 years old.
Oh, so that would have been terrifying. I would have been,
I was kind of like terrified because I wasn't sure where my dad was, but then I was relieved when I found him, and then I was once again terrified when I looked up. He wasn't a scary looking man though, so it was.
That's good.
He held your hand,
right? He held my hand, yeah. He's like, yeah.
If it was Jay or I that the kid turned around, it would have scared them a little bit more, maybe.
That's right. My dad's visiting soon. I'm gonna grill him. Are you really my dad, or are you that guy from the flea market?
Yeah. He took over. You don't remember, but the flea market guy kidnapped you and now raised
If my real dad's out there and you're listening. No, that's not. I know. Believe me. You put my dad and I in the same room, and there's no mistaking where.
You can tell. Yeah. I think. Well, this is one. I was at my grandparents' house with some family friends of ours, and there's this big window in like a basement. It has a walkout basement to the lawn, and I saw my family walking up, and so I was very young, and I took my shirt off, dancing in my underwear in the window.
Yes,
and they
you
came
were.
a little closer.
Yes.
And I'm like, that's not my dad. That's not my family. That is somebody else. It was our friends, and they were scarred and shocked, and I embarrassed myself.
There's a lot of Princep unclothed stories coming out in this podcast.
Well, we could rename it if you'd like.
I think I'll just step out now.
No, my clothes are on.
Yes.
We're not doing that.
No.
All right.
Have you got
Interesting.
Have you got one, Tricia?
I guess I don't know. I'm struggling to think of any time when I've
Mistaken.
been foolish like you guys. Sorry.
She's happy to call us out on them, though.
That's
for
yeah.
sure. That's so funny.
I'll let you guys stand out on this one. I think
Sounds good. If you think of one, let us know.
I will absolutely.
Yeah.
You could text Jay and we'll post it somewhere and say, "See, Tricia did do something embarrassing."
Okay, I will.
Took a while. So keep an eye out for that in case that comes at any point.
That's right. We'd also love to hear your mistaken identity stories. If you have any, you can email us. I always forget. Story Fulfilled Podcast.
Instagram Story Fulfilled Podcast and email us at
story@bfmc.org. Man, I got to get those down. story@bfmc.org.
You got to email us more so we see it.
That's right.
That's right. All
right, let's move on. And at some point before we're done recording, Trisha's going to be like, yes, I have a mistaken identity story.
So I'm really trying to think.
And she's going to let it out. So yeah, we're continuing with our episode.
Our discussion on Samuel. And so you heard us talk about who Samuel was. He grew up in the temple, basically, and was raised by the high priest. And one day he's sleeping, and he hears a voice. And he thinks it's Eli, the priest, and he comes back, and it's not Eli. And then he goes, and eventually he realizes that it's God. And so we're going to be talking about kind of this idea of hearing from God, what that's like now, what was that like then? And so I guess the first question I'll bring up is, have you experienced that idea of being called by God or hearing God in some way, and not necessarily knowing what's going on?
Yeah, I think for me, for sure. I don't know if it was an audible voice of the Lord, but I think through visions, through prayer, definitely, I would say I've heard a calling. And I think the calling of God can come in so many different ways.
Yeah.
It can also come through individuals. Yeah. So, yes, I would say yes, I definitely have.
Yeah, and that's something, like, we talked about that a little bit with Rob Webb in our Moses episode, just talking about, like, Moses. It was a spectacular event with the burning bush and everything, and sometimes we make it out that, like, it has to be that for us to hear God, and that's most often actually it's not the case. we hear God, and it's actually a journey of discerning that we uncover that it is God, and we might not even there. And when we look back, we might realize, oh, he was actually trying to get my attention for a little while, and I didn't even know it. Just like Samuel with in this situation. And so, yeah, that actually caused me, Tricia, to think about you and your call to Africa, because we were working together during the time that kind of began to unfold. And so I thought maybe you could share a little bit about the discernment process and how you kind of uncovered that God was calling you first to Africa and then to Uganda.
Yeah. So for me, I mean, going back, I had a pretty rough childhood. I grew up, I lost my parents at a very young age. So that was, I think, already how God was beginning to call me in the midst of that hard time as a kid. But as I grew up, I had to obviously handle a lot of that and deal with a lot of that, find a lot of healing through coming to know who Christ is. But when Jay, when you and I started working together at the Scott Mission, I really had a hunger for African history and didn't really understand why. So I would go into a bookstore and I would just be like, where's African history? And just hungry to learn. Never in my wildest dreams did I think that God was doing something. But through that learning process, through reading and getting to know what happened in Africa, that led me actually to prayer. And it was more and more through prayer that I would still be hungry to want to know more, and that would bring me down on my knees more. And then an opportunity came up where I was able to do like a month in South Africa, working with kids that had been affected by HIV AIDS. And that was significant because a lot of them had lost their parents and I had lost my parents. So again, that journey of where I'd come from allowed me to connect to a degree.
And with a
in
name
some
like
way.
De Boer, it only made sense to end up in South Africa, right?
That was not planned. It was actually through a common friend of ours from Scott Mission
Right.
that I got connected to a ministry in South Africa. And yeah, I spent a month in South Africa. And again, when I came back to work, working with Jay, again, more prayer, right? And so for me, I think a lot of my discerning, a lot of that has come through prayer. Learning and then getting on my knees was a lot of my process, I think. Yeah.
I really like that. The emphasis on prayer absolutely is such an important one. When you look at the story of Samuel, he was living in the temple. He was working day in and day out,
Right.
at the temple, literally in the presence of God. And that was his whole life, was working for and with God and being in his presence. So that's kind of our equivalent is doing everything in prayer.
Right.
And we can take that as great advice on how we can get close to God and especially work on discernment. One part of the story of Samuel that I found interesting is the message that he received was kind of a scary one. And you kind of said that you felt, well, looking back, you felt like, oh, he was preparing me. Did you feel any sort of fear when you realized, oh, he's calling me to go to Africa, he's calling me to go to Uganda? Was it, oh, I'm prepared for this, or was it a little bit of a scary experience for you?
Well, for me, like that learning and prayer was about a 10-year journey.
Okay.
Never thinking I would actually go like full time. But the moment, like there was a week before I really felt the Lord, the Lord called. He did call me. There was a week of really intense prayer and not a lot of sleep that week, and going to church on the Sunday morning and really thinking, I got to talk to my pastor after church because I'm pretty sure God is calling me to go. And that Sunday morning when I was at church, the whole sermon was on how Peter's in prison and there's all the guards around. And the whole message of the sermon is how many times God is calling us to do something, but the enemy puts all these ideas of why we cannot, all these guards around why we cannot do it. And for me, the night before, that was me. I was telling God, no, I'm not going to Africa full time because I don't have money. I don't have this, all these reasons why I shouldn't be going. So the whole sermon was all about that. And then I'm sitting in my chair in church that morning praying like, God, am I supposed to go? Like, are you really asking me to go full time? And the Lord gave me a vision, and I'm on the boat and he's on the water and he's saying, you have to take the step of faith. And I'm wrestling with this vision in my mind, sitting in the chair thinking, I got to talk to my pastor after church. And at that moment, my pastor gets up, and our church sometimes will give words of knowledge. And he got up, and I heard him saying he has some words for the Lord has some words for some people today. And I was kind of listening, also trying to figure out if I should get out of this boat. So I quietly, just sitting in my chair, I just say, okay, I will go. And the moment I said that, my pastor, no idea what was going on, said, Tricia, over the whole sound system, says my name, and says, Tricia, Africa will never be the same. Guys, I I bawled my eyes out, to be honest. It was incredible because I had spent 10 years not understanding. First of all, my background was brutal. Then 10 years of learning and praying and learning and praying and learning and praying and never really getting it, like why God was doing this. But in that moment, it was freeing. It was scary. It was, okay, now I know why you had me go through that process. So it was a bit of excitement, but also fear, a little bit of release, so many different things going on in that moment. Yeah.
Oh, man, it's so cool. It's so funny. I was in class last night and we were talking about how nobody remembers the sermons that we preach. They remember the people that we are. But in instances like this where God is placing a call in your life, you remember specific words that are spoken and preached. And I just think of discerning our call when we went to Cape Henry, Quebec. There was like a 1 week process where there was a sermon and 2 devotionals, and I remember them vividly because they had such an impact on just coming together to confirm what I thought God was actually saying. So it's when a sermon really sticks with you, maybe you need to dig into that a little bit and be like, oh, why, God? Why is this one really, like, why do I still remember what the pastor said 3 weeks ago?
Yeah.
Right? Dig into that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And, well, that is a perfect image of and connection to our story. Like you say, Samuel, the verses, and Samuel grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God. He was training his whole life for this role that God was raising him up to be. And little did you know, God for 10 years, like you said, had been getting you ready, training, learning, praying, growing your relationship with him, but also with people and knowledge and wisdom. And so that is a process that we don't necessarily see while we're in it, but God is ready to use you. And I really like that the emphasis on how many different feelings you were going through. It's there's an excitement, there's fear, it's an adventure, but it's scary, and it's fulfilling, but you're not sure. And I can imagine that, and that can be what God calls us to. A lot of times it's not so straightforward and easy to understand, but it's exciting.
How fun to uncover that scary call. and I think and in that though, like because oftentimes leading up to that there's so many whys, like why and then they all come into picture, but not without prayer, as you said already. Like it really hinges on taking it to the Lord, what are you saying? Lord, why? Lord, am I hearing you correctly? I thought this was the case, whatever, right? And bringing all that to him and working that out with him in prayer, which gives him space to give those words of confirmation and leading. Just so cool.
Answer this how you like, and if you don't want to answer, that's completely fine. But how do you feel? How long have you been in Uganda, or how long have you been doing what you're doing right now?
Coming to 13 years.
13 years.
Long time.
That's a lot. That's awesome.
Yeah.
After you said, yes, I'm getting on this boat, I'm stepping out of this boat in faith, how did the process go? Did it work out right away? Did it take time to figure out, or was it you're all in and off you went?
When I reflect back in that season of my life, I was definitely very strong in my faith and trusted that if God was calling me, he was going to figure it out. So I was working, as Jay mentioned, I was working in Toronto at a ministry, and I took the next few months, pulled up a leader that to take over my position that I was working in, and got on a plane and connected with one ministry that I had met for a week, very briefly. So I went to serve with them, not knowing that that wasn't my final destination, that God had different things in Uganda for me. But it was the first connection that I had. So I stepped there to see where God was going to take me next. Yeah, I think the faith piece was really key, and just allowing God to guide every step. And even when I got to Uganda, you know, I really wanted to work with people in the northern region that were affected by war. And God kept closing every door, and I couldn't get into the ministries that I wanted to serve with. But, you know, God is so amazing in that he kept me in the southern region of the country, because there was a whole group of people that had survived that war that were living in a slum in a really impoverished area. And that's where God had wanted me to be in ministry. But it was so frustrating because I'm knocking, trying to get north. But he kept me in the city specifically for those very people that had fled war, and wanted me to begin there. So again, God just continued to show his hand and where he wanted me to be. Yeah.
That's so cool. And so when I visited Tricia as she was working in that southern region, but they were in the middle of resettling a family to the northern region, which was really cool. And now, where are you now, Tricia?
I'm in the north. I finally made it north. Yeah. I'm in the northern. I moved up north in 2018.
Awesome.
Yeah. It took a while.
Yeah.
But I will say, you know, yeah, I've been in this game for a while, for sure, in Uganda. But I got to go back to that calling moment, because the truth is I think we all can say this. There are days when you're ready to pack your bags, and I'm done. This is too hard. But for me, I go back to that moment, you know, that what I just shared with you guys, because if God didn't call me, if I didn't make that up.
Right.
So I don't have an excuse to quit until he calls me somewhere else.
Yeah.
But trust me, it's not all pretty. It's really hard times, and you want to pack up the bags, but you got to go back to that calling. What did God say? Right.
Well, that's it. And that's where that prayer piece is so gigantic again, because sometimes entering into our mind is, God, did I make that up? Right. And so you got to bring that to God in prayer. God, did I make this up because I didn't think it was going to suck this bad, or I didn't think it was going to be this tough,
hard,
or, you know, I didn't expect these challenges. And so, just keep bringing it back to him in prayer to confirm that calling, which then empowers you to continue to step forward in what he has set before you. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, the strength and the faith and the belief in what you are doing comes from the fact that you heard from God, and that can be your encouragement in times like you guys just said. That's what keeps you going. It's not because you want to be there all the time and it's fun and it's great and you know you find so much joy in it necessarily all the time, but the meaning and the adventure that you're on because God has called you to it, that's what keeps you going. I think in the hard times. That's very cool.
Absolutely.
All right, so we have one more question, and I always say this to the guests, but basically answer this how you'd like to answer this. There's no right answers, but looking at the story of Samuel and kind of how we've talked about discerning God's voice and hearing from him and hearing a call that you weren't expecting, how does this story of Samuel come together to fulfill the story of God? How can we look at this and understand who God is with this story?
Well, I think one of the first things I think of is, you know, we can hear him. We just have to listen, right? He wants us to listen. He wants us to hear him. And he's not going to give up until we do hear him. And I think he's faithful in what he communicates. He's faithful in what he says he's going to do. And I think we see that definitely through Samuel and his life and all that God does through Samuel. He does a lot with Samuel. So, I mean, yeah, I think he's just so he's patient with us as well, very very patient.
Yeah.
But I think it's he wants each one of us to fulfill the calling that he has for each one of us, and it's got to come back to that listening and talking. It's two-way communication between us and him. And we see that in the life of Samuel for sure. And that will lead us to the fulfilled call that God has for every single one of us. Yeah. And I think recognizing that each one of us are on different journeys. Samuel had a specific role. Jay has a specific role. Like, we all have our own roles in part of this huge kingdom puzzle that God is putting together, right? But it's the listening, the hearing, the talking back, having those conversations, and going back. What did God say? Yeah. What did God say? What did God tell us to do? Standing on that truth and those promises. Yeah.
It's so good. Like, the problem is never that God is not speaking. It's that we are not positioned to hear him.
Yeah.
And so we need to, and we each hear God in different ways, as we've talked about, right? And so knowing how we hear and encounter God, how we hear the voice of God, and positioning ourselves so that we can hear that, is so important, because he is continually looking to speak to. One of my favorite verses in the Bible is Jonah 1:1, and the word of the Lord came to Jonah, because God speaks. And so the problem is never that he's not speaking. It's just that we need to be able to hear him.
And be ready to step out of the boat when he does call you, because, he can call you to some very, very cool things. And that is what we are called to do as Christians, is to step out, to live out whatever call he's asked us to do. And it's so cool to see that you're living out that call and chose to step out in faith. So thank you so much for coming on the episode.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to say before you go?
You can drop a web address for Ela.
Yeah, you can definitely find out more about what we're doing in Uganda at www.ilauganda.org.
Cool. So go check that out. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks
on the
for
show.
having me, guys. Appreciate it.
Great.
See you later.
Bye for now.
Bye.